There's no systemic challenge that we face, from the impact of climate change to the financial crisis of 2009, or even the current Ebola crisis, to which any one of you under the age of 30 would say, it's okay, never mind, it's cool to do nothing. And that's why all of us here believe that you, the delegates, actually matter. You would, and you do, demand change, and you do demand it now. And we believe that from among you, there will be world leaders who drive real positive change. Leaders like our great counselors. But where will the world find leaders like them? Like Kofi Annan, like Sir Bob, like Professor Yunus, like Mary Robinson. The world will find them right here. And we ask you, each of you, is it you?
And to make sure that you really get it, or you'll be in big trouble, we want to introduce someone who was one of our original inspirations. He gave us support and gave us a video to take to Google Zeitgeist way before this was actually even a reality. There are just a handful of names in the world, wherever you go, no matter where you are, you say the name and everybody knows exactly who you mean. And that only happens for people who have done something never before done, who really make a difference, and in this one, a huge and global difference. In the decades to come, he will be known and remembered as the first to translate the power of musical fame and recognition into a real force for good in the world. He is the most tireless, the most indefatigable, the most uncompromising, the rebel with a cause, a campaigner for all that is good, and a loud and ceaseless shout and rage against all that is wrong. He's the original and our first One Young World Councillor, Ireland's great son, Sir Bob Geldof.
Well, hello everybody again. I'm the worst part of this week. I'm always moaning. Welcome home. I don't think there's anybody in the world who actually doesn't come from Ireland at some point. I mean, President Fox over here, his family came from here 400 years ago. President Obama is from here. President Xi of China, he's from here. Chow was just telling me that you're from here, aren't you? James? Yeah. Boris Becker, he learned his fucking tennis here, I'm telling you. The thing is, we are a tiny little island. And watching the flags again, part of me thinks I'm sort of dreading it because I really dislike nationalism. But then it starts and I think it's cute, like the kids' school plays, and then I become very moved. And then I think there isn't a single country here where there isn't something that's wrong. And then I think there's so many little guys here, so many of their young adults so proud to wave their tribal markings. And that's us in Ireland. We get buffeted, we get blown apart by the global winds, largely because of the backwash from the great powers, the big guys. And we can do very little about it. But for whatever reason, this country talks up a storm in the face of global turmoil, a storm that can rebut a lot of the false arguments of our time. In the First War, 100 years ago, almost to this month, 2 miles down the road, I have an Auntie Fifi. She's 106. Before her mind went off to a different part of the human universe, when she was 103, I sat down with her in Mount Merion, and I asked her about the First World War. There isn't a single one of you here in this room whose countries were not affected and devastated by the war and the great flu epidemics that followed it that killed even more people. It was a war that wiped out all the past economic systems and all the past political systems up to that moment. And it was preceded by a single tiny event in a tiny country that had no true significance. There was no real need for this great mass suicide of the human race. There was no need for this great cultural wipeout. And I asked my Auntie Fifi, had she any foreboding? Was there, within the family, was there any sense that something truly momentous, something truly barbaric and beyond imagination was going to happen now? She was a very young girl. But she said, no, she has no memory of there being really any difference. Now, 2 years later, in this country, and we will celebrate it in a couple of years, some revolutionaries, some teachers, some poets, some trade unionists decided to take matters into their own hand and begin, or continue, a long fight for independence. She never felt that, but I have in my house framed the letters from the British commander of Dublin City allowing my grandfather to leave in the middle of our rising, in the middle of our rebellion. But there was no sense in our family that this was coming. And yet I remember sitting here in Dublin during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and my father being desperately afraid, a man who tried to defend this country in the Second World War, while it remained neutral once again and tried to remove itself from the great currents of the world, but of course couldn't. And he was uniquely quiet and solemn and deeply troubled. And it was unusual for me to see him so. And I asked him what was happening. I'd seen the priests running up and down the corridors and in the classrooms whispering to each other. There was a great sense of fear. And my dad said, I think there might be a war. And I said, will we be in it? And he said, it doesn't matter. It'll be the last war. Now, I tried to tell you last year that my sense of foreboding of this tiny little rock, this tiny blue thing, where the only possibility of human existence is, as far as we know, in the universe. And a year later, I'm telling you now things are worse. I know afterwards you come up and say, Bob, give it a rest. You know, it's not that bad. It is. It is. We don't need 1914 again. And where will it be? Your country? Is it Syria? Is it Gaza? Is it Ukraine, where once again another country can just walk in and we do very little about it? Is it Afghanistan? Thank God there were no black flags today for those murderers in IS. Where is it? Where's the little spark that for no reason at all will set off the next conflagration? And is it because this little rock, where there's too many of us? Is it because, as Mary said, we are going about destroying any possibility of life, not just for us old guys, not just for you coming of age people, but when you start having children? The future is always contingent on now. And we do not as a species act out of self-interest. We act in the needs of the moment. What we want now, we have to get. And yet, I don't know about you, but there's something deep and scary going on. The great Irish poet of the 20th century was W.B. Yeats, possibly the greatest poet in the world of the 20th century. And he wrote one of the most terrifying poems ever written in the English language. It was called The Second Coming. And he wrote it just after the conflagration of the First War, which killed 250,000 young Irish boys and women. This little country that really can't afford a single death. And he saw it happening again. He saw the ruins of what we had made and destroyed, it happening again. We must act out of selfish self-interest if we are seriously, really seriously now. Mary put it politely. Our Prime Minister, Taoiseach, talked about it with greater depth than the usual political speech. There is not one person here who will probably disagree with me. They might put it better or differently. But we are at a critical moment. And before it all happens, I'm going to take Mikhail's rocket and I'm going to go into space because I want to see the vulnerability of what we are and who we are and the little place that allows us to exist, to think. Think. That's what we need you to do. For the next 2 days, please, God, think. You see, here in Ireland, there was nothing else for us to do except talk and argue. That's what we did. But we didn't really have economic options, so we did go out to the world. There are roughly 170 million people who directly are descended from the Irish, and still we leave. We're too small to really sustain the numbers of us. And that's true of the world right now. But in this tiny island, as you may know from your own news, we are no strangers to civil strife. We know economic devastation and growth. We know about state and religious corruption. We know all the things that affect your countries. We know about brutes who are our leaders. We know about no leadership. You cannot be a leader and be a thug. You cannot be a leader and be a brute. And we know about the lack of leadership in the great democracies. Where are the leaders of Europe? Where, when an ex-chancellor of Germany sips Putin's filthy champagne and takes his dirty money and is once again a German chancellor complicit in the invasion of the Ukraine? No shame? No shame. Well, we have to feel the shame over the next 3 or 4 days. We have to talk it through. We have to imagine what all these things that we have in our back pocket, these services that have been invented, possibly the greatest invention in the history of mankind, we have to understand what it means, what greater communication means, what it is we're going to communicate, why the great new companies of the future, of this supposed golden age, your Facebooks, your Googles, your Amazons, your Apples, are no different to the companies of the past, monopolists who seek to sell you if you let them, where the state believes that it can intrude in your life and monitor everything you say or do, not just in China, but in the FSA in the United States. I don't want that world, never have. There's too much wrong. What are we doing about Sierra Leone? A country just beginning to breathe. And because they're poor, they die. Like back in the 80s when myself and this woman here and her husband and a bunch of us got together to talk about what was happening in Africa, in the great African famines. They were not dying of hunger. They were dying because they had no money to get food, because the state had no systems, because it had no money. They are not dying of this filthy little virus in West Africa. They are dying because, unlike in Madrid and Texas, they do not have the doctors, the nurses, the Medicare. They are dying. They are dying because they are poor. I don't like that. That cannot stand. We must think. We must find a way through the terrible situation we've blocked ourselves into. And we must navigate an elegant, intellectual path to a newer freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are capable of that. But our time is gone. If you don't do it, there's a problem.